begin by saying that off to a good start. Our keynote speaker got you excited. Makes you want to have a few more sheep, doesn't it? And so soon we'll be talking about the environmental impact of dental amalgam from two of the experts in the academy who've had done a lot of literature research, and I think Dr. Rubin has spent a fair amount of time in Seattle listening to the Seattle Water District and the Sewer Control and the Dental Society all hassle about what we do with this and what we do with that and whether or not it's toxic or not. Marcia Basciano and Paul Rubin have been members of the Academy for many years, and that they've expanded on their presentation on the environmental impact of dental amalgam. And so, without further ado, Marcia and Paul, please come forward. I am going to
have to get unhooked.
Well, going on after Murray is kind of like having a show on NBC after Seinfeld. It's a nice act to follow. We're going to be talking about mercury in the environment with a special emphasis on the dental office effluents. Well, thanks for bearing with us a bit. Now, will the real Dr. Marcia Basciano stand up?
I have to hold these?
Well, you can clip them on somewhere. Do you have a pocket that this can go in?
No.
No, you can clip it somewhere.
Here. This is for the
Yes, it's not.
okay. We are fast becoming environmentally aware, and hopefully not too belatedly. All of us at home and in the office are recycling and reusing and helping along the environment. But what about organized dentistry? I submit to you that organized dentistry...
Technical problem. They have to be clipped on. It's creating static to each other.
Two. I don't think Clinton has as many. How's that, Wayne? Okay. I submit to you that organized dentistry, even in the face of mounting scientific documentation, is remaining criminally negligent of the effect of amalgam on the environment. To support my opinion, I would like to present to you scientific data not only on the pathways that amalgam enters into the environment, but also discuss its insidious nature on the ecosystem. I want you to remember that this scientific data is almost entirely from non-dental resources. It's from biologists, chemists, and wastewater engineers. And I would like for you to view this presentation not from an egocentric point of view, whereby we think what fish is safe from what lake to eat, but from a broader sense of stewardship, that we're all placed on this earth in order to take care of it for generations to come. One example of organized dentistry's ignorance, if you will, occurred in Pima County, Arizona, where in the span of 5 years, 71 out of 75 violations of excess mercury in the effluents, not affluents, occurred from dental offices. The dental bureaucracy there stated, yes, we dump amalgam, yes, there's mercury in the amalgam, but it's safe to put in your teeth and it's safe to put in the landfill, end of quote. They based this comment on what they said was a study that they commissioned. However, the wastewater treatment engineers in Pima County that we have talked to said they never saw this study. Does the dental industry actually use enough mercury to make a difference? In 1991, 5.6% of all the new mercury mined was used by the dental industry. Now, 5.6% may not seem like a lot in a scope of 100%, but remember it equates to 100,000 pounds of new mercury that must be mined each year in order to satisfy the U.S. dental industry. Keep in mind, too, that other industries, as the paint, battery, and pharmaceutical industries, are using less mercury in their products, and I would surmise that the percentage for dentistry will only go up in the coming years. The environmental impact begins as soon as the dentist mixes the mercury compound. He or she makes a conscious or unconscious decision of what to do with that mercury compound that they certainly want out of their office once it's mixed. Whether to pick a recycling after it's caught in the trap, whether to put it in the wastebasket and send it to a landfill, whether to implant it in partly or wholly in your patient's mouth, or whether to send it down the drain into the wastewater treatment plant system. In informal questioning of dentists, it was approximated that 15% of the mercury compound that's mixed is not used as an implant in the patient's mouth. It's considered dental scrap. Now, if the dentist also had to cut out an old amalgam, that is considered dental scrap also. Hopefully, the big chunks that are cut out are caught in the trap and sent to a recycler. The smaller parts would bypass in the form of slurry and go right past that trap into your wastewater treatment system. Utilizing figures from a Seattle, Washington study on the disposal habits of dentists and correcting them for the average amount of mercury in an amalgam filling, the editors of BioProbe have estimated that as much as 35,000 pounds of scrap amalgam enters landfills alone each year in the United States. Nationwide and worldwide, the impact of dentistry on the environment through the wastewater system is being recognized. A recent study by the Western Lake Superior Sanitary District has estimated that as much as 29% of that amalgam goes down the drain into the wastewater system. Why be concerned so much about a substance, mercury, that the ADA claims is a naturally occurring substance? Well, the levels that dentistry are spewing out into the environment are not in normal concentrations. They're forming compounds that are not normally found in those amounts. And the Clean Water Action Report stated that only 1 pound of mercury placed in a lake 18 square miles large can contaminate that lake to the effect that you could not eat any of the organisms out of that lake. Remember, we're talking about 35,000 pounds alone in the landfill system. Why be concerned if mercury goes down your sewer system? Isn't that what we pay our taxes for, to have a wastewater treatment system? Well, there's a problem with that for several reasons. One, in the United States, it is law only to have a wastewater treatment system that cleans to the secondary level. That is, just remove 90% of the solid particles from your water. That's all it has to do. Though some of us are lucky to live in areas where there's a primary treatment plant system where bacteria actually scavenge or eat many of the chemicals that go into your water. But with heavy metals like mercury, silver, tin, neither system takes them out. They go through the 8-hour treatment plant system and come out as sludge. And what happens to the byproduct sludge? It's either dumped in the ocean and contaminating the aquatic system there. It's either burned, thereby spewing mercury vapors into the atmosphere, or it's placed on your farmer's field as fertilizer, not only contaminating the food chain, but also the ecosystem for agriculture. Go back a minute. Don Armstrong of the Pima County, Arizona wastewater treatment system has stated that the only way to have cleaner sludge is to have cleaner effluents in the beginning. And he stated the only way to have cleaner effluents is to consider each person putting down anything down a sewer as an industry. We must start considering each dental office as an industry. To put it another way, all of us play with the same toxic ball that the big chemical companies do, but for some reason we stand aghast when we're asked to play by the same game rules. Don Armstrong was also the engineer who came under fire by the ADA for his scientific methodology in measuring the impact of amalgam on the wastewater system. Apparently, he took a standard EPA test whereby he put the amalgam particles in a slightly acidic solution, titrated it for 24 hours, and measured the effect. The ADA chastised him for using amalgam and calling it a mercury test. The dentist suction tube is not the only way that amalgam enters the environment. In many states, you can even send your recycled amalgam through the mail, dry amalgam through the mail in an envelope, and hopefully your recycler, no matter how you send it to the recycler, is more responsible than this one in Connecticut that created a monumental environmental problem. Dentists who sent the recycled amalgam to this recycler picked up the $600,000 bill. And contrary to public opinion, your patient's mouth is not the only place or the safest place for amalgam to be. Nature's way of avoiding the body burn in a mercury only adds to the sewage system problem. This type of investigation was originally cited in the literature in 1934 and is being re-investigated by several sources at this time. Even after death, your patients can contaminate the atmosphere further with their amalgams. Those that are cremated, their mercury fillings vaporize into the atmosphere. Some countries have gone so far as putting selenium scrubbers on top of their crematorium smokestacks. It is estimated in the U.S. alone, 2,800 pounds of mercury is spewed into the atmosphere each year by U.S. crematoriums. When considering the relative toxicity of metals, mercury is usually the most toxic in terms of its effect on fish and man. Silver, another major component of amalgam, is second, followed by some other materials. If we were to look at the toxicity of metals when discussing the most sensitive stages of marine organism reproduction, we see mercury and silver still as 1 and 2, followed by copper. And as you all know, copper amalgams have found new favor in the dental office. This list looks pretty much like a who's who of dental materials. And I want you to realize when looking at this list that even though these metals can be at the same concentration, they vary tremendously in their impact on the environment. To appreciate that impact, let's look at the EPA standards for freshwater systems. Nickel, if it was placed in the freshwater system, is allowed only at 88 micrograms per liter. An easier way to think of that is 88 parts per billion, or 88,000 parts per trillion. We go all the way down to cadmium, which is allowable at only 2 micrograms per liter, or 2,000 parts per trillion, a much more 44 times more toxic than nickel. Silver, which I do not have on this slide, is allowable only at 60 parts per trillion, or 0.06 micrograms per liter. What about mercury? Mercury is allowed at 0.012 micrograms per liter, or 12 parts per trillion. It is 5 times more toxic than its next nearest competitor, silver. I want you to keep in mind that these standards are not total protective standards for the ecosystem. They're a marriage of what man finds tolerable to continue his lifestyle that we've all become accustomed to, and as a mild protective system for the ecosystem. Why isn't mercury as toxic as silver as toxic as mercury? For one, it's not spewed in the system as much because it's much more valuable than mercury. It's not as easily bioaccumulated, a term that we will discuss shortly. And it does not as easily convert to other metal compounds that can be more toxic than the original mercury element that is spewed out. What makes mercury so unique and so toxic? It's one word: methylation. In the 1960s, in the Minamata Bay disaster, it was found that an overwhelmingly amount of mercury in the fish was in the form of methyl mercury. even though the polluting plant spewed out mercury only in the inorganic or phenylmercury forms. This puzzle was solved in 1969 when it was found that there are organisms that can actually methylate, microorganisms that can actually methylate mercury on their own. The methylation process can take place with enzymes and without enzymes, with oxygen and without oxygen, and it commonly occurs on the slimy sediment layer of fish where the bacteria sits. So we have a system whereby the ecosystem can actually change the less toxic forms of inorganic mercury, phenylmercury, and mercuric salts to the more toxic methylmercury. Some important facts you should know about methylation. Even though mercury is discharged as mercury metal or mercuric salt, 70% of the mercury found in aquatic organisms is in the methylmercury form. Now, methylmercury is more lipid soluble, thereby it enters the brain more rapidly. And depending on certain environmental variables, monomethyl or dimethylmercury can be formed, which are even considered, the monomethyl is considered more lethal to the ecosystem. Most disturbing is the fact, and this is an important concept, that the aquatic organisms actually prefer to take the methylmercury out of the water and absorb it into the system, even if there's more non-methylated mercury in the water. Now, this is kind of a self-destructive setup, but this is the way the ecosystem works. Now, due to the biota's or the organism's preference to methylmercury, we see a big difference in what's called the biomagnification between methylmercury and mercury. Let's say we place an X amount of mercury in the water. If we go up the food chain, which I will discuss in a moment, we find as much as 5,000 times that mercury in the larger organisms. But if we were to look at methylmercury, which the organisms prefer, you can find as much as 85,000 times of mercury. It's important to understand the variables that affect the rate of methylation as well as the availability of mercury to the organisms, and they can be classified as either biotic or abiotic. Biotic variables depend on what type of ecosystem is present, and they involve concepts as biological half-life, unique species response, and food chain. We're all familiar with the concept food chain. It is an important concept, but it's grossly oversimplified, especially if we talk about mercury in the system. Big fish don't always eat little fish. And mercury from the diet is not the only source for the organisms. We have that mercury in the water all the time with the microorganisms that the larger organisms actually extract. When we look at biological half-lives, we can appreciate to be human, and our biological half-life is approximately 70 days. If we were to look at eel and flounder, 1,000 days is the biological half-life. So the old standby of eating smaller fish and not larger fish because it may be safer is not really a good guideline. Some examples of unique species response would be found in the Canadian seal, where the mother's placenta actually protects the fetal seal from the mercury load. I like to think the Canadians are quite clever like that. And we also have organ specificity, whereby we can find mercury in liver, in the kidney, maybe in another organism we would find it in the muscle or the brain or the fat layer. Acute toxicity levels vary greatly, and also, which is not on the slide, inhibition levels. As low as 1 part per billion of mercury in an ecosystem will retard the photosynthesis of plankton. And as we all know, plankton is the basic nutrient for aquatic organisms. If we were to look at abiotic variables, they can be divided into physical and chemical conditions. Physical conditions have to do with things like sediment and current. The sediment layer of an ecosystem is considered a reservoir, if you will, of mercury. When the variables are right, that mercury can be pulled out of the sediment layer. The more sediment, the more area that mercury can sit and be pulled out later. Currents has to do with the movement of a water system. Usually it is considered that a water system, as a river or a stream, helps in diluting the toxicity of materials. What we see with mercury is this is not quite correct. When you have more flow of water, you have more oxygen, and methylation does prefer the aerobic condition. You also see more water flowing over that fish that has that slime layer on it, and so you have more methylation occurring. So that isn't even a protected situation for mercury. Some chemical variables would be, again, the oxygen. The more methylation. And if you increase the sodium chloride content of the water, you again have more methylation. We have two good guys, finally. We have sulfides that can combine with mercury to inhibit mercury-forming compounds with other more lethal metals. And we have selenium, which is usually found in a one-to-one relationship with mercury and is considered to have some homeostatic regulation. If you put other heavy metals, which usually occurs in a polluted area, if you put other heavy metals in with the mercury, you have two things that happen. Some of those heavy metals, like cadmium, actually have the ability of pulling out more of that mercury from the sediment. And you also have those heavy metals forming with mercury to form more toxic compounds than mercury alone would be. If you lower the pH or increase the acidity of a system, several negative things happen. Mercury leaches out of the sediment more quickly, and the organisms, let's say the fish, become extremely stressed and they respire more quickly. With quicker respiration, we have more water flowing over the gills, so those methylating bacteria are doing their job at a faster rate. As a conclusion, I would like for you to remember that the variables we talked about that increase methylation and increase the availability of mercury to the organisms are variables that we just about cannot control at all. So what we're doing is putting a very toxic material in an ecosystem, several different types of ecosystems, and magnifying it as much as 85,000 times to its toxicity. We need to start looking at dental offices as industries. We need to stop making a market for new dental amalgams. Thank you. We're going to cover questions at the end in the speaker's forum. And now I'd like to reintroduce Dr. Paul Rubin, who will give us some feeling of control on the whole situation. Yes. I didn't have it last night, though. I wasn't taking any chances.
Well, let's take a look at some of the more practical ramifications of all this information and what does it really mean to us. We need to kind of look at really how much mercury is involved, how much is going into the environment, which Marcia touched on some, and is this really a significant amount? Marcia spoke a little about Pima County, which is where a lot of this fuss first started several years ago. And I want to give you just a little bit more of an insight into what happened in Pima County and what is happening in other areas of the country and why. This came about because the wastewater treatment facilities were concerned about an increased amount of mercury that they were finding in the mercury sludge in their wastewater plants. This was a concern to them. They traced it back to find out where is this coming from, and through some testing following on up the sewer lines, discovered that a lot of it was coming from dental offices, and decided it was important to control this amount of discharge from dental offices as they are mandated to control it in other industries. And so they began to treat a dental office as another industry, requiring that they have a permit for discharge and that they would have to comply with the discharge limits that every other industry would have to. Sounds logical, but the people from the American Dental Association came down, and through some political movements, they got the local government in the Tucson area to more or less back down, and dental offices were exempted as being a discharge industry. This is still an ongoing battle. There have been similar concerns in my hometown, the Seattle area. The local governing group there that deals with sewage treatment facilities is called Metro, and they did a study in 1991. Their concern was the same. They were finding periodic peaks or spikes in the mercury they were finding in the wastewater sludge. And as Marcia was saying, when the wastewater that comes into the plant is treated, it's cleaned up to varying degrees and is either discharged as clean water, which in our case goes into Puget Sound, and then what's left over is we've called sludge, or what is now being called biosolids. They were finding higher levels of mercury in the biosolids. Why were they concerned? It has to do with what's the ultimate end point of these biosolids. As Marcia said, they used to put it in the oceans. They can't anymore. So in some areas it's incinerated, but in a lot of areas, like in Puget Sound, it's taken and spread on farmlands as fertilizer, or in some cases over the forest lands. In other words, Metro sells its sludge. EPA has regulations that say how much mercury can be in that sludge. Metro cannot sell its sludge if the mercury levels are too high. So they're concerned about meeting the EPA guidelines, and therefore to try and reduce the mercury content of the sludge and what goes into the treatment plants. So again, they found that a significant amount of this seemed to be coming from dental offices. They worked fairly cooperatively with the Seattle dental societies in trying to get some input from dentists on what possible solutions there may be to reduce this. Remember now that their concern is with reducing their intake of mercury into the sewage treatment plants. They held a wastewater conference in spring of this year, March or April of this year, which I attended. It was co-sponsored by Metro and the Seattle Dental Society, the Washington State Dental Association, and Washington Dental Service, which is our local version of Delta Dental Plans. I'm not sure why they got involved with this, but they did. I wrote a report about this conference, which you may have seen in the spring issue of BioProbe. If you haven't, you can refer back to that. But what was interesting to me was the meeting was opened by the president of the Washington State Dental Association, Dr. Victor Berry. In his opening statements, he wanted to make it very clear that, number one, this is a local problem. We're not here to set a precedent for the rest of the country, as if what happens in Puget Sound pollution wouldn't happen anywhere else. Number two, he said very clearly, we are not here to discuss the safety of amalgam. We know amalgam is safe. End of question. That subject was not even allowed to be brought up in this whole meeting. Number three, interestingly, he said, we're here to talk about amalgam, not mercury. And the whole discussions about treatment or filtration systems or how to capture this kept focusing on the word amalgam, and they wouldn't even acknowledge that, hey, the real problem is mercury. But this all started because Metro was concerned about mercury. They didn't know anything about amalgam or even what amalgam is. They were seeing mercury in the treatment facilities. And yet our local dental groups are saying, well, we're concerned about maybe amalgam, but this isn't mercury. I just don't understand this kind of thinking, as Murray called it, stinky thinking. So, well, put together a top 5 list. Top 5 list of responses from the American Denial Association. Okay? Number 5, the famous Dr. P.L. Fan, who says we're not talking about mercury here, we're talking about amalgam. Number 4, the attorney for the American Dental Association in an article said, we plan to be very proactive on this issue. I guess what he means as proactive is we'll send out Dr. Fan to tell people we're not talking about mercury here. Number 3, this is a direct quote from Dr. Victor Berry, president of the Washington State Dental Association. That train done left the station, he says. Number 2, well, I paraphrase this a little bit based on remarks you have heard from this famous Dr. Baratz. For you in the back, when you mix mercury with human waste and cook it in a sewage treatment plant, well, there's just no mercury left in it anymore. Number 1, well, I've got 2 tied for the number 1 responses. I hope you can see this one in the back. Probably can't. Sheldon Newman addressing the ADA House of Delegates. If amalgam mercury were a problem, we would have noticed it by now in our own health. And tied for number 1 response. So how much mercury is really going out of the dental offices? Metro developed a testing protocol using a format something like this. Basically, they used an air-water separation tank just after the line comes out of the suction tip from the patient's mouth. In other words, before it gets diluted with any other water from the dental office, they wanted to measure the concentration right there. They found in their results, Marcia had mentioned on some of this, you don't have to look at this whole business here, but mercury is somewhere in the middle there. There was a range of results that they found ranging from 12 to 480 milligrams per liter of concentration of mercury in that substance that's coming out of your suction tips. The mean is about 150 of probably about a dozen offices they tested in the Seattle area. Now, the local limit for discharge, allowable discharge for industries in the Seattle area is 0.2 milligrams per liter. Now, you can talk about dilution is the solution here, but even if you diluted this 100 times, and I don't think you have, back up, you're going to collect about a liter or so of liquid from your suction in a normal one-doctor dental office, maybe even 2 liters, not much more than that. Even if you diluted that 100 times, and I don't think any of us are flushing 100 liters per day of water down the drain, even at 1,000 times, you're still not going to be able to reach, in many cases, the local discharge limit. Dilution is not the solution here. Bioprobe did some estimates, which I think are on the conservative side, about how much mercury is really coming into the environment from different sources. And their estimate, conservatively, based partly on the Metro studies, is that mercury coming out of dental office effluents is about 5,000 pounds per year nationally, just from the dental office waste stream. Now, there are admittedly no studies yet that show the so-called smoking gun that has shown some demonstrated proof that mercury from dental offices in the waste stream, in the landfills, has created XYZ problem. But I don't think it takes a genius to see that the information that's been presented here and that you've seen elsewhere means there's a problem going on here. Amalgam sitting in a patient's mouth where mercury vapor is measured coming off of that, and think of that ground up into such fine particles where the surface area is almost infinitesimally enlarged, acted on by bacteria in a sewage treatment plant, ground up, heated, whatever, dumped and sprayed on a landfill. To think that there isn't going to be some possibility of harm from this mercury is just boggling. So if we assume that there are at least the potentials of some problems here, I would suggest that we, as members of this academy, ought to take the forefront, ought to be at the forefront, take the initiative and acting truly proactively, and let's do something about this in our own offices. The technology is there are products there, and I'll talk about them in a few minutes. There are others that are eventually going to have to comply begrudgingly because regulations will come down. There are presently no regulations anywhere in this country. There are in Europe, in several countries that are required to have filtration systems that remove a certain percentage of mercury from every dental office in those countries, such as Germany and Sweden and other countries. Metro in the Seattle area will have a regulation as of January 1st, 1995, that will be requiring all offices to have some mercury recovery unit that will be capable of reducing at least 90% of the mercury coming out of the dental offices. It's coming. The regulations are coming. I don't think we need to wait for them. I'd say it's time for us to act responsibly now. There are several vendors that have systems available. 3 major companies. I'll talk about them in a minute. Metro in our area is now putting through some rigorous testing to be sure that they all can meet their requirements and comply with being effective at a certain level, etc. I'd like to look at what would be an ideal system if there were such a thing that really is the best way to go. And I'll run through these elements, which I think are very important. I've had a system in my office for probably 2 years, and I've tested several different systems, actually. And based on my experience and what I've learned, this is what I would consider elements of an ideal system. It should be quiet and unobtrusive. You don't want something that's a box the size of a refrigerator and makes so much noise that you can't even hear yourself talking to your patients. It should be easy to use. Staff is going to gripe and complain if this is some complicated machinery that they have to turn on, turn off, empty, flush, whatever. You should be able to get it installed and forget it and not have to take a lot of your time or auxiliary time to maintain the operation of the unit. It should function with no compromise in your suction power. I've had units in my office that reduced the suction power so drastically it was practically unusable, and I couldn't wait to get them out of the office. So this is something that you really have to look at. Metro is requiring that in our area they be effective at a 90% level. The units that are available now can do much better than that. They can do pretty close to 99%. I think that the process of emptying them or changing them needs to be clean and safe and easy. This is hazardous material. You don't want something that you or your staff is going to have to get your hands into and have a complicated procedure of taking this stuff out once it's collected. So there should be an easy way and a fairly safe way of doing that. Very important part is the recycling of the material should be provided for. This is one of the biggest, toughest areas in this whole question. It's not that hard to come up with some kind of system to separate this stuff out of your wastewater. It's very hard to figure out what am I going to do with it now. There virtually is only there's almost nobody in the country that will take this stuff to recycle it. You're used to sending things into a metal recycler such as scrap gold, and when some of you who used to do amalgams, you would send scrap amalgams into a refiner and they would take it and recycle it. Those companies will not take amalgam sludge from your wastewater. There is only one company, Mercury Refining Company in New York, and I'll talk about them in a minute, that will accept this stuff and only under certain conditions. So it's very difficult to find a way to get rid of this stuff. It's real nice if the company that provides you the unit also provides the service of recycling it. And you want it to be reasonably economical. You don't want something that's going to cost you $10,000 for every operatory to put this in your office. There's the question of whether it should be a chair-side unit versus a central one. This may have to do with your own office configuration. I think it's generally easier and works better all around if it can be done centrally. How well do these systems work? As I said, of the major manufacturers that have them available now, they work very well as far as effectiveness. They will reduce amalgam, probably at close to the 99% level. A couple of quick slides based on some metro studies that were done a couple years ago measuring the effectiveness of these units. This is mercury discharged in milligrams per liter. There were a couple offices that they measured here. One of them was mine. They were showing a mean of about 1,300 milligrams in one office, 480 in another office, milligrams per liter. On the right, the yellow dots there represent the measurements after the filter or after the recovery system. And it got down pretty close to zero. They got better than 99% reduction. They also looked at mercury discharged in milligrams per day. This is an interesting number. Forget the concentration, forget how much is diluted, how much stuff is really coming out. Around 500 milligrams per day from these two offices. Now these aren't a statistical average, this was just two random offices in Seattle, but if they're fairly typical, you could multiply that out by the number of general dentistry offices across the country and get a pretty astounding figure. And again, looking at the post-treatment levels, they're quite low. So they are effective. There are currently 3 major devices that are available now. Actually, there's another one I just heard of last week before I came down. I'll tell you about that. DRNA is one that has some people here. You can talk to them. Medisys is a company. DRNA, by the way, originated in Sweden. It was a Sweden filter system. Medisys was originated in Austria. And Dürr was a German company that's now being marketed through Air Techniques. So these are all ones that have had some experience in the European market. American plumbing systems, American vacuum systems are very different. These do not easily translate over to our systems, and there have been some problems in trying to get them to work right in American systems. I'd like to show you a little bit about what I've seen and know about these systems to give you some information to go on and making some decisions yourself. DRNA has a filter system that looks like this, looks like a little car battery. It's a filter. It works, this is more complicated than you need to worry about, but basically there's a air-water separation tank, which is in the center there. Or here's how it was originally set up in my office. The top is a separator tank. The black box is kind of in the middle there. The air and fluids are separated as the suction is ongoing all day. When the suction is turned off, the fluid settles down and filters into the filter and is removed. You don't have to mess with it. You don't have to turn anything on or off. It basically does itself. Tim from DRNA, who you can talk to here, has come up with a better way of doing this in my office. We don't even have to use the separator tank now. So they've been able to simplify this a lot more. And Tim has worked real hard to figure out how to adapt this to American systems. When the filter is filled up, which probably will take 6 to 9 months, something like that, you simply unhook it, put a new one in. The filter goes back to DRNA where it is recycled. They do the recycling for you. They do it through this company, Mercury Refining Company. This is the only company in this country that I've been able to determine will accept mercury sludge. They will accept it from DRNA. Interestingly enough, they have an exclusive contract with DRNA. They will not accept mercury sludge from any of these other companies. That was a pretty good marketing trick that they've done there. We'll get back to that again about recycling in a minute. This is the Medisys system. It's a more complicated centrifugal system. Diagrammatically, basically, its centrifuges is out. The particulate matter, it settles into a collecting chamber. Periodically, that collecting chamber will fill up and has to be recycled. Medisys, this is a unit that might be at chairside, although they now have it available to install centrally as well. Medisys is one that, as of a couple years ago, was unacceptably reduced the suction power in my office. I have talked to them this spring where they told me that, no, we've got that problem solved. Now you can install it centrally. No, there's no problem with suction. I asked them, where in North America do you have one installed that I can talk to the people who run it? And he said, well, we don't yet. So as far as I'm concerned, it's not yet test proven. They do claim that they will they will take the material and recycle it. Their recycling operation is in Austria. Now, I don't know about all the regulations involved, but I would put it to you, you need to be very careful that you know where this stuff is going. There are regulations, there are laws. You have to understand the chain of accountability and chain of responsibility. Where does this stuff end up, and how legally is it being done? Because ultimately it may have recourse back to you. If you remember several years ago from the case in Pennsylvania where some recycler dumped stuff into the ground, wasn't refined, it was declared an EPA hazardous site, and the dentists who contracted with that recycler were ultimately responsible for paying for the cleanup. So you better know where this stuff is going, and are the regulations clear? Are they following everything by the book? My question is it really allowable to export this hazardous waste from this country to Austria? And I don't have the answer to that. Not to mention, how is it shipped across country? Air Techniques now has this system from Durr that originally developed it. Again, another centrifugal system, similar in its function to the Metasys system. They do not provide any recycling. That's up to you. I did find an outfit in the Northwest that says they will come to your dental office after you've collected a bunch of stuff, and they will pick up this material, and they will recycle it. In fact, they do this for a number of industries. They collect and dump a lot of sources into one big barrel and send it back to Mercury Refining Company. Northwest Enviro Service, and they're trying now to come up with a way to market this to dentists so that dentists will have a way to give this stuff to them. They have a contract that the dentist must sign, because the dentist has to first disinfect this material. The stuff that's sludge from your operatories is a biological hazard. It has to be converted to a hazardous waste from a biological waste by disinfection, because nobody will take it as a biological waste. But their contract has this clause in it. That you have to sign. I further certify the material does not contain any human tissues. Whoa, I didn't mean to hit that. Let's go back. Where's my reverse? I further certify the material does not contain any human tissues, including but not limited to teeth, gums, blood, or saliva. Well, of course it does. You can't sign this. Are you going to sign this and find out the recourse is someday going to come back to you? So the recycling part of this is very tricky. So this critical part of the system is how this gets recycled and who's going to do it. There's a local company in my area that has just marketed, because they know the metro rulings are coming down, jumping on the bandwagon. Well, we've got a system that's much simpler. It's not a filter. It's not a centrifuge, et cetera, and much cheaper. And I called and asked them about what it is. And basically, he's got a system which is very simple, and any of us could do that. An air-water separation tank. Then you let the material sit and settle over a 12-hour period, and then just pour off the liquid, keep the sludge. It's going to effectively remove probably 90%. But it takes a lot of work on your staff's part to every day have to decant off this liquid and re-hook it up, et cetera, et cetera. And I asked them, okay, what do you do with the sludge that you've collected? Well, we don't have that solved yet. But we figure the container that we provide will hold up to about a year's worth, and we figure that a year from now we'll have that problem figured out. Meanwhile, for a year, every dental office using this is virtually a hazardous waste site. I don't think so. So I think the remedies to this environmental problem are some things that we can do something about. Number one, we should be installing an effective mercury retrieval system. From all that I've seen today, the one that has its act together is DRNA. I don't have any business relationship with them. I don't have stock in their company. They've got their act together and they've done it right. Number 2, the thing that we're all aware of, we need to stop using this material in the dental profession. The answer to this in the long term has to come from mercury-free dentistry. So I'll leave you with that. I will be available anytime during the weekend if any of you have questions for me of how my system has operated in my office and problems that I have encountered. Marcia and I want to stay very much in tune with everything that's going on nationwide or worldwide with this environmental issue. I would ask of you, if you see anything going on in your local areas, and by the way, we just have heard from Detroit, the same concerns are going on with the Detroit systems from Minnesota. There are county studies done in Minnesota that are showing astounding levels of mercury coming from dental offices. It's snowballing all over the country. We want to keep in touch with this. If you hear anything, please call us. I would be glad to give you my phone number and Marcia's phone number. We want to know what's happening across the country. My phone number in Seattle is area code 206-324-1100. Marcia's is 1-900, oh no, that's wrong. Here's, Marcia's phone number is area code 708-629-6299. Or she has a fax number, same area code 708-629-1133. And thanks for your help in letting us know information too. Yes.
I know you're all chomping to get at the morning coffee break, and we're just right on schedule. Thank you very much for an excellent presentation, Paul. I do have a little housekeeping information for you. If you go out the back door and go to the left, you'll be eating the physician's food. They said they didn't mind, but they want you to stop and look at their booth. But if you go out this door here is our food. So just so you know whose food you're eating. We're going to take about a 15-minute break, and then we'll be right back. The ladies from the dams are having a raffle, and then you can get 5 of these tickets for only, or you can get 6 of these tickets for only $5. So stop at the dams thing and see about the raffle. As a matter of fact, the Tri-County Dental Society, which is up in north here, about 100 miles, invited Dr. Sheldon Newman and Michael Ziff to come debate the safety of dental amalgam. And that the debate was actually an all-day debate, and where they'd present their sides and they'd argue and they'd do this and do that and do this and do that. And toward the end of the afternoon, Dr. Newman, who was quite worn down by the fact that he had very little science, tried to cite a little bit of research that he was kind of familiar with about some men and women that had had some amalgam work done and had experienced this and that. And he wasn't really sure who the author was, and he wasn't really sure how many people were in the study, but he did know the university. And then when he got all done, well, what do you think of that, Mike? And Mike said, well, I think you're referring to, and he knew the name of the author, the name of the study, and he said there were 37 women and 12 men. And then he went on to show how the results showed his point was proven rather than Dr. Newman's. And Dr. Newman looked at him, well, you certainly got the science on your side, but doesn't 150 years of use count for anything? And I don't remember what Mike said, but I would say if a 150-year-old mistake is a 150-year-old mistake. So Dr. Mike Elziff has some late-breaking news, so if you'll step forward and share with our Academy what you just found out.
Thank you, Dr. Kennedy.
There are 3 of them.
3 of them. Am I coming through on all 3 now? About 30 minutes ago, this was handed to me by a new member of the IAOMT, Michael Balin, DDS. Is Mike in the room right now? All right, Michael Balin is the treasurer for the American Academy of Head, Neck, and Facial Pain. The document is entitled, The American Academy of Head, Neck, and Facial Pain Petitions for Answers in the Mercury Safety Issue. This is an organization of over 500 dentists in the United States. I'm just going to read you a few sentences from this document. As a certified board and academy of practitioners dedicated to the treatment of patients suffering from head, neck, and facial pain, the board of directors of the American Academy of Head, Neck, and Facial Pain are concerned with all etiological factors that may contribute to the development of pain and dysfunction. One substance commonly used throughout the world in dentistry is mercury in dental amalgam and dental restorations. Mercury toxicity has been implicated in, amongst other things, chronic headaches, tinnitus, muscle fatigue, bruxism, joint pain, dizziness, fatigue, and clinical depression. And then they go on to discuss about the amalgam having been shown as the largest non-occupational source of mercury in the human beings. And Dr. Michael Balin was appointed as chairman of the committee to investigate the scientific effects of mercury from dental restorations and to make recommendations to the academy. Now, they go on to cite the various research, and then the committee's investigation of the following actions are based upon the American Dental Association's Code of Professional Conduct, Section 4A, Sub 1, which states, quote, a dentist who suspects the occurrence of an adverse reaction to a drug or dental device has an obligation to communicate that information to the broader medical and dental community, including, in this case of a serious adverse event, the Food and Drug Administration. And they then state that it is unanimous consensus of the committee that we presently request our re-evaluation of all past and current scientific literature on the mercury amalgam issue by the following organizations: the American Dental Association, the Food and Drug Administration, Occupational Safety and Health Administration, National Institute of Health, National Institute of Dental Research, and U.S. Public Health Service. The committee respectfully requests that these organizations, after carefully reviewing literature, issue a current policy statement concerning the safety of mercury-containing restorations for patients in whom they are placed, to the dental personnel handling these metals, and to the environment in which the waste is disposed. And they conclude, with the availability of comparable and in some cases better restoration materials than silver amalgams, we, the committee, urgently request that these organizations, to wit those that I just named, to determine whether it is practical, prudent, or ethical to continue placing silver amalgam in the oral cavity.
And the answer is getting more and more clear. A number of years ago, I met a young man from Billings, Montana. He was I think at the time, the only mercury-free dentist in the state. Now there are 2. So there's been a 100% increase in the number of mercury-free dentists in Montana in the last few years, and that you're going to have the pleasure of listening to a young man that has great courage, insight, and the ability to crank out lots of letters, and that he's going to talk about some of the systemic influences of dental amalgam, and he'll show you some of the brochures that he's prepared, and that he also has encouraged all of the members of the Academy to alert the medical community with these letters and these kinds of informations with a word processor you can contact and develop, as I have in San Diego and he has in Montana, a referral group of knowledgeable physicians to work with you to treat this situation. And without further ado, Dr. Gary Strong. Okay, I'll come wandering in the back and you'll see me. Put that in the pocket. Hang on to those. Click your clickers with that.
Before I begin, I want to make a brief statement about the book that's available out there. I wrote this specifically to educate professionals in my area. As the flyer in the front of your handout indicates, there are 8 topics with 40 to 50 references per topic. The topics are Alzheimer's disease, cardiovascular disease, free radical pathology, immune system dysfunction, ion metabolism dysfunction, kidney dysfunction, neuropsychological dysfunction, and reproductive disorders. You can photocopy these off one section at a time and give them to health professionals in your area to encourage them to take a look at the science behind the issue. There's more research coming out all the time, but that may help get them started. I also have 3 pamphlets. There's some samples out there you can look at. Some of these, 2 of them are with references on root canals and chronic jaw cavitations. There's lots of articles that we can refer to, and reprints are available, but these help the patients get started and also help your health practitioners. A 3rd one I have is mercury in your dental fillings. It's an analogy. We've all seen these things. I am Joe's stomach, or I am Joe's heart, or whatever. It sounds kind of corny, but some patients really relate to that. And so this is from that perspective. I'm the mercury in your teeth. What can I do to your physiology? Written without references for the lay people to get some idea of what's really going on. So, without any further delay, we'll go ahead and start talking about glutathione. Turn on the, let's see, whoops, back up one. Glutathione the topic of glutathione can be a very complex topic. Because we have a wide range of educational backgrounds, we'll try to make some editorial comments to make it relevant to some people who may not have had some science in their background. But regardless, here we go. Glutathione is an endogenous antioxidant tripeptide consisting of 3 amino acids: glutamic acid, cysteine, and glycine. This is the structure as represented by this chemical diagram. The actual active site of glutathione is the sulfhydryl group right there. In fact, its primary function is to protect sulfur metabolism in our body. Okay, I'll get the right direction here. Glutathione is the most prevalent intracellular thiol. The SH group is also called a thiol, or a sulfhydryl group. It's the most prevalent one in living cells. It participates directly and indirectly in numerous functions. It is the primary soluble intracellular low molecular weight compound providing a continuously maintained integrity of structure for living cells. Impaired glutathione status is being implicated in the pathogenesis of several diseases and degenerative conditions, especially in those associated with free radical injury. Pardon me, I'll get the buttons right here in a minute. Virtually every cell has a group of enzymes constituting the gamma-glutamyl cycle. This accounts for the synthesis and degradation of glutathione. It functions as a distribution point and intersects with a number of large biosynthetic pathways. So glutathione is very important to many synthetic pathways. It also functions in the storage of cysteine, storage and transport of cysteine, the molecule which has the sulfhydryl group on it and is the central part of glutathione. A major portion of the primary degradative enzyme, the gamma-glutamyl transpeptidase, is located on the outside surface of the cell wall. I'll say why in a minute. Most glutathione is made within each cell from its constituents, as mentioned before, glutamic acid, cysteine, and glycine. It's also made from degraded plasma glutathione from the liver. The liver produces appreciable amounts of glutathione. It's dumped into the hepatic vein or the bile at a ratio of about 3:1. Transepithelial transport of intact glutathione does occur from within the intestines into the plasma. However, most of the glutathione is made within the cell. The gamma-glutamyl transpeptidase enzyme on the outside of the cell breaks down glutathione from the plasma into the components, and the components are transported inside, and then the synthesis actually occurs within the cell. Intracellular glutathione is usually in the 0.5 to 1.0 millimolar range, of which more than 99% is generally in the reduced as opposed to oxidized status. You'll notice that reduced glutathione glutathione is represented by the GSH symbol. Oxidized is the GSSG. The SSG represents two glutathione molecules from which we have lost the reducing equivalent. Glutathione donates a reducing equivalent, which is a hydrogen with an electron. That may help you understand the symbol. Plasma glutathione usually is in the micromolar as opposed to the millimolar range, of which more than 90% is in the reduced form. 2/3 to 90% is utilized by the kidney. Glutathione is specifically protective of the kidney against nephrotoxins. In fact, the bioprobe has had several abstracts on this. Under conditions of oxidative stress, for example, toxicity, the oxidized to reduced ratio of glutathione increases. In fact, several organs have been shown to release oxidized glutathione into the plasma. For example, the kidneys and the heart. Glutathione acts as a reducing agent, donating the reducing equivalent I just described a few minutes ago. It acts as and supports our oxygen radical quenching antioxidants. For example, the superoxide dismutases, of which there are several, glutathione peroxidase, catalase. Also, the plasma dietary antioxidants, vitamin C, vitamin E, beta-carotene, etc. It maintains the sulfhydryl and disulfide status of proteins, especially enzymes. We'll talk about these in more detail. It protects against xenobiotics or pollutants of some kind. It neutralizes free radicals directly and non-enzymatically, such as glutathione binding directly to mercury, or indirectly and enzymatically by utilizing various enzymes within our cells. It participates in liver detoxification via the glutathione transferase molecules and the cytochrome P450 enzymes. It acts as a coenzyme, and it acts as an essential cofactor. Now, in this area, what we're talking about is the difference in the way glutathione is utilized in various enzyme pathways. For example, in some cases, reduced glutathione becomes oxidized as it donates its reducing equivalent to a molecule, which then goes through a chain of events, and in the end, we still have the oxidized glutathione. As opposed to, in other cases, the glutathione transferase molecule transfers intact glutathione to a molecule, rendering it electrochemically and stereochemically available for enzyme pathways, at the end of which the glutathione, still in the reduced form, is now regenerated. My analogy I like for this is like when you're traveling down the road and make a bathroom stop. You go get the key, you take the key into the bathroom, you come back out, give the key back to the man. Glutathione is a bathroom key. It's just being used as a passport to allow something else to happen. And of course, we're talking about this issue because of the mercury issue. And Dr. Vinley very well talked about how we have mercury coming out of the fillings at all times, so I won't need to discuss that. In fact, I left that on purpose, knowing you'd be in front of me. So in 1991, the World Health Organization stated that the general population is primarily exposed to mercury through diet and dental amalgams, with dental amalgam providing the greatest degree of exposure. There's no question about that. Studies utilizing DMPS, that's the dimercaptol propane sulfonic acid challenge doses, have correlated increases in urinary mercury to the number of intraoral amalgams and confirmed these World Health Organization statements. That could probably use a little focus if someone could, please. Approximately 80% of inhaled mercury vapors are absorbed into the blood by the lungs. To this exposure, we must add direct mucosal exposure to the vapors, direct mucosal exposure to ionic mercury generated by electrogalvanism or the battery effect. We also have microparticles of amalgam from abrasion within the GI tract. Where's the wear? That's where the wear is. Highly toxic at a molecular level due to high surface area and microbial metabolism. We know the microbes can act upon these particles, and the greater the surface area to volume ratio, the more chance we have for actions to occur. The mercury vapor in the elemental form is highly liposoluble. It's easily dissolved in fats. And the cell walls have 2 layers of fats, and because of these layers of fat cells, mercury readily goes right through them. So mercury goes into the blood, through the lungs, or into the blood right through the mucosal wall in our mouth, and it's changed to the divalent cation form by catalase enzymes. As it's circulating in the blood and this change is occurring, any of the mercury that diffuses into the tissues through the cells is also being acted upon within the cells as it diffuses out of the blood. general reaction is going from elemental mercury over to ionic mercury. It is an equivalent reaction. It goes either direction based upon the antioxidant status. They have fed ionic mercury to laboratory animals, and as a result, they can off-breathe mercury vapors later on. So they can go either direction, but the general direction is to the right. And most of the salts, as Dr. Vimy talked about, the mercury chloride and the various salts of methyl mercury eventually end up as the ionic mercury forms. And of course, Dr. Thomas Clarkson, of international repute as a toxicologist, has stated, the ionic mercury form is believed to be the proximate toxic species responsible for the effects of inhaled mercury vapor. In 1990, Woods and his group out of the University of Washington proposed that the ionic mercury conjugates with 1 or 2 glutathione molecules depending upon glutathione availability. Under ideal circumstances, with a limited mercury exposure and adequate glutathione supplies, a mercury to glutathione ratio of 1 to 2 is formed, which is excreted by the urine and feces. With chronic mercury exposure and or glutathione depletion, and I would add to that antioxidant depletion in general, mercury glutathione at a ratio of 1 to 1 is formed by default. This form may still act as a free radical, perpetuating instead of resolving free radical pathology. We'll talk about free radicals shortly. Ample research confirms that the ionic mercury complexes with glutathione. It reduces glutathione tissue levels, it limits its availability for any other functions, and potentiates oxidative injury. In addition, ionic mercury and virtually all other forms of mercury have been shown to inhibit virtually all of the enzymes of glutathione metabolism. Glutathione synthetase, which is part of the gamma-glutamyl cycle, glutathione reductase, which recycles glutathione. It utilizes a reduced equivalent donated by NADPH, so we have a significant interplay of important enzyme systems to regenerate glutathione. Glutathione peroxidase, it's our primary defense against hydrogen peroxide and other lipid peroxides that are formed during cell degradation, because you must keep in mind, we're not staying in one place metabolically. They estimate there are 5,000 chemical reactions per cell every second to maintain life as we know it. And in the course of breaking down and regenerating hundreds of millions of cells daily, we have hydrogen peroxide being generated. So the system is there not just because we have new toxicants in our environment, it's there because of what metabolism has to occur to maintain life as we know it. Glutathione transferases, especially in liver detoxification, are also inhibited by mercury forms. In fact, the transferase molecules are not just involved in liver detoxification. We're also talking about transfer of the glutathione as a cofactor, as talked about earlier. In fact, leukotrienes, prostaglandins, and some of our catecholamine hormones, for example, estrogens, have at some point during their synthesis a molecule of glutathione attached to them that allows specific reactions to occur, and then it's separated at the end of the enzyme chain. And here's some references. Some people are thrilled about references. In fact, the Academy is trying to base what we're talking about upon science. In 1985, when I first called Murray Vimy to ask him some questions, he said, we've got to base what we do on science. And part of what I started doing with these letters, which you have in the book form, initially they were 10 or 12 references, and then they went on to 15 or 20, as I was proving to myself and to some friends that I had in the professions that, yes, there was some science to this issue. Pretty soon it became a self-consuming interest. Enzyme inhibition has long been recognized as a major property of mercury in biologic systems. For example, and this is merely an example, it's estimated that at least a third of our enzymes are sulfhydryl dependent. Mercury, we know, inhibits sulfhydryl dependent enzymes, but these are a few important enzymes that some of which we'll talk about as we proceed. Cytochrome P450, extremely important for liver detoxification. Superoxide dismutase, that handles our some of our oxygen radicals. The sodium potassium ATPase, oops, I left our T out there, is very important for maintaining ion and electrochemical gradients at the cell level. Calcium ATPase, catalase, lactic acid dehydrogenase, creatinine kinase, isocitrate decarboxylase. And the sulfhydryl interaction is not the only manner in which mercury can interfere with protein structure, but it is one of the key ones. The mechanism of action on these and other enzymes is generally an increase in oxidized glutathione or decrease in reduced glutathione, which inhibits protein synthesis. This alters the sulfhydryl disulfide exchange required for the enzyme activity leading to protein synthesis. Both initiation and elongation of protein synthesis are affected. This alters the primary and tertiary protein structure. That's digging back pretty deep for some of us who haven't had chemistry for a while. The protein has 4 levels of structure: primary, secondary, tertiary, quaternary. Tertiary structure is where we get our 3-dimensional structure beginning, where the protein molecule is folding in on itself and developing some form to it. That tertiary structure is extremely dependent upon the sulfhydryl activity, disulfide bonding between different portions of the protein molecules, and the status of the cytoplasmic melee. In other words, everything surrounding this protein molecule as it's forming in the synthetic pathway determines how it's going to fold on itself and form a 3-dimensional shape. The quaternary structure, so we have 2 proteins coming, 2 tertiary forms coming together, independent proteins coming together and forming one molecule. They're generally joined together by disulfide bonds. Now, we're not just talking about enzymes. We're talking about proteins in general. And a primary example is insulin. Insulin consists of 2 polypeptide chains, 2 proteins. And there is 1 disulfide bond within the A protein. And then there are 2 disulfide bonds between the A and the B proteins, which comprise insulin together. The insulin receptor on the surface of the cell, in fact, the insulin receptor actually sits within the cell wall. And there are 4 proteins. They're in series, lined up, 2 A's between the 2 B's, and they span the cell wall. So a portion sticks out into the ground substance between the cells, a portion is inside the cell, and they're in series, lined up within the cell wall, and there are disulfide bonds between each of the 4 subunits. So not only is the insulin receptor susceptible to possible interference by disulfide interference, but also it's very dependent upon the integrity of the cell wall. And as we'll see later on, mercury can contribute to lipid peroxidation. If you alter the structure of the cell wall, you alter the structure of the proteins, the structure and the functions of the proteins that are contained therein. The susceptibility of these sulfhydryl and disulfide bonds depends upon the stereochemical availability to oxidants, the chemistry of the adjacent chemical structures, and the chemistry of the cytoplasmic or plasma melee. An example of this would be albumin. It's a very large molecule. It is a backup antioxidant. It has 1 sulfhydryl group available to help contribute to the antioxidant process. However, the large physical structure and the location of the sulfhydryl group is such that it's sort of buried inside its structure. Only very reactive oxidants have a chance to alter the sulfhydryl status of albumin. It's protected by this big mass of chemistry around it. Not only that, but the relative condition of the thiols, the other sulfhydryl groups in the solution surrounding the albumin, affect whether or not the oxidant will ever reach that single sulfhydryl group on albumin. Glutathione peroxidase. Here's one enzyme we know is inhibited by mercury, a very important molecule. It takes 2 peroxide molecules and 2 reduced glutathione molecules, turning them into 2 water or alcohol molecules and generating 2 oxidized glutathione molecules in the process. This, of course, again, is reduced and recycled by glutathione reductase. It can use complex hydroperoxides as substrates, not just hydrogen peroxide. We'll look at catalase in a minute. Catalase has 1 single purpose. This has multiple functions. It can handle lipid hydroperoxides, aliphatic hydroperoxides, and aromatic hydroperoxides. So very complex molecules can be reduced and neutralized by glutathione peroxidase. Glutathione peroxidase is also selenium dependent. Selenium is described as a redox active cofactor to glutathione peroxidase. We know that mercury binds to selenium in a 1-to-1 molar ratio. In fact, some people have used mercury to detoxify against selenium intoxication. But most of the time we think of that in reverse, where we're using selenium to protect against mercury. In this combination of 1-to-1 molar ratio, this does not seem to affect the excretion of mercury, but it does remove selenium from its availability to be used as a cofactor in glutathione peroxidase. So we see two ways in which mercury affects glutathione peroxidase, by direct inhibition and indirectly by removing selenium from circulation. Catalase, on the other hand, is much simpler in its function, but equally important in handling oxygen radicals. It takes 2 hydrogen peroxide molecules and makes water and oxygen. Some of the catalase enzymes, as you will remember, also change mercury from the elemental to the divalent cation form. Okay, I've mentioned free radicals briefly. One of the significant manners in which mercury becomes toxic or renders toxicity to us is by generating free radicals. And by definition, a free radical is not a non-incarcerated political extremist. We know that. It happens to be an atom or a molecule with an unpaired electron, generally in its outer orbit. The unpaired electron confers electrophilia upon radicals, free radicals. Electrophilia means it's simply this molecule likes electrons. It's attracted to the electrons of other molecules. So they steal electrons from molecules in biologic systems. And what happens is that as the electron is stolen from one molecule, then it will steal an electron from its neighbor, and the molecules are sort of passing around this hot potato. And in so doing, as the electron transfers are occurring, the molecules themselves are rendered non-functional to the biologic system many times. So they may exist for only milliseconds, but the damage is done before you can realize what's happened, of course. Free radicals have been implicated in over 100 diseases, including the following: cardiovascular disease, cancer, AIDS, arthritis, diabetes, aging, and neurodegenerative disorders. On this last one here, we know, for example, that Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, often called Lou Gehrig's disease, and multiple sclerosis, all of them have reduced glutathione levels and or reduced glutathione peroxidase activities. So there is definitely an oxidative or free radical component involved to the neurodegenerative disorders. And of course, we know there's also literature that show that mercury may be involved in several of those I just talked about. A number of metals readily accept or steal, as I said, electrons from molecules and then transfer them to other molecular species. In fact, in our minds, we talked about how glutathione may bind to mercury at a 1-to-1 ratio or 1-to-2 ratio. In fact, mercury can perhaps interact with dozens of sulfhydryl groups before it actually is attached permanently to another molecule. And we're not sure of the biochemistry of this, but it seems that mercury will have a toxic effect far and away greater than the effect that if it bound directly to glutathione was taken out of circulation right away. This electron transfer is generally the basis of metal toxicity. The mechanism of toxicity for mercury and other heavy metals most often involves this electron transfer with the sulfhydryl or disulfide groups of functional biologic molecules, for example, enzymes and proteins. First line of defense against any free radical, including mercury, is glutathione. Okay, we're not just talking about mercury. I mean, we like to think of that, but we can't have blinders on because we're talking about a system that is very interdependent, and you cannot add something to the camel's back. We're talking about the old story of the camel with all the straws upon its back. Mercury, true, is a lot of straws, but we have a lot of other straws. And so let's talk about some of them that contribute to increased free radical exposure. For example, stress, pollution, other xenobiotics or pollutants, and decreased oxygen concentration. That's a question mark at this point, but it is true for large cities especially. I differentiate between pollution and xenobiotics because some of these chemicals are in our foods, or in the clothes we wear, in the water we drink, etc. Some of them are put on purpose. Some are put there on purpose as opposed to being a true pollutant. Okay, stress, especially chronic, alters the chemistry of energy metabolism and generates free radicals. And I'm sorry I can't read that reference. I don't know how we can get everything in focus, but in fact, most of these references are in the book I have out there, except some of the glutathione won't be there because I haven't submitted that. I'm submitting that to a journal, and I have another article on diabetes will be submitted here very shortly. Pollution from civilized lifestyles generates chemical exposure, no question. The National Resource Council states that about 70,000 chemicals are used in industry and commerce, and that no information was available on any aspect of the toxicity of approximately 80% of these molecules. That was 92. We are the guinea pigs. The Office of Technology Assessment states that more than 65,000 chemicals are in the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's inventory of toxic chemicals. The agency annually receives approximately 1,500 notices of intent to manufacture new chemicals. And of course, we're the guinea pigs. A few xenobiotic species enter the organism as relatively stable free radicals. Most become converted to radical species in vivo within living tissues by non-enzymatic mechanisms called autooxidation or by intracellular oxidizing enzymes. Synergism between the endogenous free radical production and xenobiotics from food and chemical sources is a serious burden on protective antioxidant capacities. Reduced ambient oxygen concentrations, especially in major cities. The average oxygen concentration is around 19% throughout our country. Most cities, the large cities especially, it's around 12%. In the large cities, on the bad days where they have the warnings about how bad pollution is, it gets down to 12%. There have been some estimates, in fact, some references to the fact that oxygen may have been as high as 30% around the turn of the century. I have not been able to find those at this point. Now, why is that important? Oxygen acts as an electron sink, which receives electrons generated by the respiratory electron transfer chain during the production of ATP. So as our cells are making energy from which to survive, to function all these enzymes and so on, it's generating electrons. And oxygen sort of sucks them in. The sequential reduction of ground state oxygen with two unpaired electrons to water generates several radical oxygen species. This is a schematic of that, and at each step, oxygen is taking on electrons. My own theory about this is that the aerobic metabolism has as a byproduct the removal of harmful electrons that are very reactive from the system, generating less reactive oxygen radicals that, although they're damaging, we have enzyme systems to handle them more appropriately than these other uncontrolled electrons. Common free radical mediated reactions are, again, they're very similar to mercury. It's because mercury acts as an oxidant or free radical. Regardless, free radical actions are sulfhydryl and disulfide reactions at multiple or single sites, protein cross-linkage, lipid peroxidation, LDL oxidation, cell membrane depolarization, DNA fracture. That's a partial list. However, we also know that free radicals are essential for life. They're not all bad guys. We know that free radical exchanges occur in energy metabolism, phagocytic cellular destruction of microbes and foreign substances, prostaglandin metabolism, the complement cascades in blood clotting, oxidation reduction metabolic reactions, and the detoxification of xenobiotics. So at this point, we've been talking about this straws in the camel's back approach. Now I want to talk about specific systems that are inhibited by by glutathione depletion. Because if a system is dependent upon glutathione, then there's going to be some problem with the removal of their dependent factors. And I have to keep in mind that mercury is only one of many glutathione depleting chemicals to which we are exposed. Okay, DNA synthesis is glutathione dependent. An enzyme called ribonucleotide reductase reduces all 4 nucleotides for the first step in DNA synthesis. So with all these cells that are being torn down and new ones being made, we have to have DNA, obviously. And the first step is inhibited when glutathione is depleted. Glutaredoxin is the glutathione-dependent hydrogen donor. Glutarodoxin, this glutarodoxin system transfers the reducing equivalents, that's that hydrogen molecule, an electron, from NADPH to ribonucleotide reductase using glutathione as a transfer mechanism. Research has shown that increased oxidized glutathione concentrations strongly inhibit this system. And obviously, glutathione depletion results in increased levels of oxidized glutathione. Amino acid transport is glutathione dependent. The gamma-glutamyl transpeptidase transfers the gamma-glutamyl moiety to L isomers of amino acids. So one enzyme in the gamma-glutamyl glutathione synthesis pathway is used to tag another molecule onto some amino acids for specific amino acid transport. Cells with secretory and/or absorptive functions have increased activity of this enzyme. For example, the mammary tissue has been studied quite a bit to confirm this particular enzyme activity. Heme synthesis is sulfhydryl dependent. Hemes are made of porphyrin and iron. Hemoproteins perform many essential biochemical functions. So the porphyrin and iron combination get incorporated into a large protein and becomes a hemoprotein, the most common of which would be hemoglobin. That acts as our red blood cell oxygen carrier. Myoglobin, another typo. I haven't found these till now. Myoglobin is the muscle cell oxygen storage molecule within the sarcoplasm, or the cell cytoplasm of the muscle. Cytochromes are involved in the mitochondrial electron transport during energy production. Peroxidase and catalase, as we've talked about, are involved in peroxide neutralization. And the cytochrome P450 enzymes are very important, involved in liver detoxification of chemicals. Heavy metals, especially mercury, alter normal heme metabolism. It does it in two ways. Not only does it inhibit the rate-limiting step of heme biosynthesis, but it also enhances the rate-limiting step of heme degradation. So it's working against it on both ends. It inhibits the biosynthesis, and it increases the degradation of the heme molecule. The glyoxylase system is glutathione dependent. Frankly, they don't even know why this is there. But as you'll see, it's found in all life forms. They know it's a very important system. There's some theories about it. It catalyzes the conversion of methyl glyoxyl to D-lactic acid via the intermediate SV-lactoyl glutathione. Aren't you glad I told you that? It consists of two enzymes and uses glutathione. Most of the system is in the cell cytoplasm, the cytosol, and some is found in the organelles within the cytoplasm. It's found in all life forms. Glyoxylase activities change around mammalian cell growth cycle. So when we have proliferation of cells and growth within an organism, they have observed an increase in glyoxylase activity. It has a functional role in neutrophil activation associated with modification of the microtubular cytoskeleton. This system may transduce functional signals to the microtubule cytoskeleton through the influence of SD-lactoyl glutathione. So here we have another aspect of how mercury can interfere with microtubular function. We know research shows that mercury inhibits, actually it breaks up microtubules into the components called tubulin. We know that that tubulin buildup inhibits microtubule synthesis. So here we're altering the function of the microtubules another way. And so here we have cells in which their skeleton, the microtubule system, is being altered either physically or functionally by mercury. Glutathione protects against free radical-mediated lipid peroxidation. Glutathione acts as an inhibitor and repair mechanism via glutathione peroxidase of peroxidation-induced damage. Lipid peroxidation results in increased cell wall permeability. It disrupts transmembrane electrochemical gradients. It depolarizes cell walls and renders cell wall transport enzymes non-functional. These enzymes, of course, as I stated, are dependent upon the stereochemistry, the shape and chemistry of the molecules surrounding them within the membrane. Many authors report mercury-induced lipid peroxidation. Okay, what does this mean? When we have the cell walls being attacked by any oxidant, not just mercury, we have it becoming more porous. And the function of the cell is very dependent upon the concentration, the relative concentration of molecules within and without of the cell. It's also very, very dependent upon the relative charge, electrical charge inside and out of the cell. So we'll see in a few minutes here exactly how it does that, which enzymes are involved. There's some more sources for that. It's amazing. What amazes me, I believe, more than just the fact that this information is available, is that many of these articles have been around for 20 years. Not all of them. Some of the more technical and impressive articles have been more recent, but some of the stuff has been around for years. The activation of thyroxine, the T4 to T3, is glutathione dependent. Now, we all know about, well, we all have heard about thyroid deficiency and so on and so forth. Well, our thyroid hormone is produced with 4 iodine molecules, the T4 form. At the cell level, a monodeiodination occurs, changing it to a T3 form. It can't just be any iodine that's taken off that T4 form. It's a very specific deiodination reaction. If it takes off the wrong one, we have a degradative product of 3,4, a T4, and it's non-functional. So it's very specific. So there are at least 3 iodothyronine deiodinating enzymes, and they all require thiols, generally glutathione, as cofactors. Glutaredoxin, which we talked about as being involved in DNA synthesis, is very likely another cofactor, which is also glutathione dependent. Arachidonic acid metabolism is also glutathione dependent. Alterations in glutathione concentration affect the profile and quantity of arachidonic acid metabolites. Arachidonic acid is basically the beginning point of prostaglandin and leukotriene metabolism, both of which are very involved in the inflammatory process. Leukotrienes are a very important product of white blood cells as well. Prostaglandin synthesis is dependent upon the concentration of glutathione and the concentration of the peroxides in the cytoplasm. So the cytosolic peroxides actually activate prostaglandin synthesis. Glutathione transferase metabolizes endoperoxides and hydroperoxide metabolites of arachidonic acids in glutathione synthesis. So what we have then, this is one of the cases where glutathione transferase attaches glutathione to one of the metabolites going through the arachidonic acid synthetic pathway for prostaglandin synthesis. Leukotriene synthesis is glutathione dependent. The availability of leukotriene precursors and the profile of the leukotrienes formed are dependent upon the concentration of glutathione and the extent of glutathione peroxidase activity. Glutathione transferase is a component of the leukotriene synthetic pathway as well as the prostaglandin synthetic pathway. Interestingly, leukotrienes also induce increased liver glutathione production. So the liver kicks out more glutathione if specific leukotrienes are produced and made available to it through circulation. Increases in extracellular glutathione as a result of leukotriene-induced glutathione efflux from the liver, and this increased glutathione is thought to help detoxify oxygen radicals at sites of inflammation. Insulin release is glutathione and thiol dependent. It has been repeatedly demonstrated that insulin release in response to glucose is related to the redox status, or the state of islet thiol. glutathione allows appropriate thiol disulfide exchanges. So there's some very, very critical exchanges occurring between the sulfhydryl and disulfide bonding going on around the place where insulin is being produced. And mercury has been identified as one of the most potent sulfhydryl bonding agents capable of modifying insulin-glucagon metabolism. Glutathione enhances insulin secretion in elderly subjects with impaired glucose tolerance. So now we have another potential mechanism where mercury can interfere with diabetics. We have the insulin itself, we have the insulin receptor, we have insulin release. Now the mechanism behind the sulfhydryl-initiated insulin release is mediated by some other factors that mercury can also affect. It's mediated by the concentration of calcium and the changes of that concentration within the cell. It's mediated by an inhibition of the potassium efflux, or release of potassium from the cell, with subsequent cell membrane depolarization to a threshold potential. What that means is that the cells, the ions like potassium, like in a nerve cell, for example, we have potassium on the inside and we have sodium on the outside, and we have an instantaneous depolarization, and the molecules flood back to this equal concentration on each side. Then the enzymes quickly put them back where they belong. So that's a depolarization. It's an instantaneous change in a nerve stimulation, but we have a similar thing happening here to initiate insulin release from the islet cells in the pancreas. So now we look at the calcium metabolism. It's also sulfhydryl-dependent. Active calcium extrusion and sequestering occurs via enzymes within the cell and the organelle walls. In other words, calcium is within the cytoplasm, and calcium is pumped out of the cell and or into the organelles within the cell, reducing the calcium ion concentration in the cytoplasm. So there it sits until a signal is received, and then all of a sudden these cells, or cell organelles, release their calcium into the cell cytoplasm, and then we have a change that initiates, well, cell signals are transduced by calcium concentrations for many different functions in the body. This is just one of them. So the cell organelles that have been shown to sequester calcium are the mitochondria, the nucleus, and the endoplasmic reticulum. So we have the calcium ATPase enzyme and the sodium calcium enzyme, which are transport enzymes. They are sulfhydryl dependent, and they sit within cell walls. Heavy metals, especially the ionic form of mercury, inhibit intracellular calcium transport. Various physiologic functions are mediated by relative changes in this concentration. Mercury very specifically inhibits the calcium ATPase molecule and the sodium calcium ATPase molecule. So we've talked about the calcium, and I'll talk about the potassium, because there's another molecule concerned about. The sodium-potassium transport enzyme pumps 3 sodium out and 2 potassium into the cell. So there's our chemical gradient. We have more sodium outside and more potassium inside. But also we have more of a positive charge outside the cell than inside the cell. And this is the electrochemical gradient that the cell expends about a third of its energy to maintain. 30% of the cell's ATPase is consumed in this action right here, pumping 3 sodium out and 2 potassium into the cell. This maintains an electrochemical gradient. It is the basis for molecular transport for many ions, some sugars, and some amino acids. Because there's this electrochemical gradient down which certain molecules can just sort of flow. Without this gradient, you'd have to have specific enzymes to transport molecules across the membrane. But if they establish a gradient, then they can ride sort of piggyback through various pores, if you want to call it that, through various enzymes that can utilize the energy that's stored in this electrochemical gradient. So mercury very specifically inhibits the sodium-potassium ATPase enzyme. There's many references on that. I've just written out a few to represent what I'm trying to say here. lipid metabolism may be glutathione dependent. I can only find one reference at this point, but they've shown that dietary glutathione decreases total cholesterol, triglycerides, and phospholipids. This happened in rats fed on a high cholesterol diet. And if we look at the status of the lipids in many people in our country, they're all messed up. Well, could it possibly be that our antioxidant systems are simply overwhelmed? This can't be helping, right? Glutathione depletion is occurring. Cell growth and differentiation is glutathione dependent. A glutathione threshold has been observed. In other words, if glutathione levels get too low, cell growth and differentiation won't happen like it's supposed to. This interference is based upon multiple mechanisms: reactive oxygen species, enzyme inhibition, cytoskeleton assembly disruption, and macromolecule synthesis. Lymphocyte activation and/or proliferation, responsiveness to mutagens is glutathione dependent. Glutathione depletion lowers the mutagenic response. Addition of glutathione to culture reverses this depression. Age-associated impaired T-cell mediated delayed type hypersensitivity, so this is a white blood cell's response to an exposure, can be reversed with glutathione supplementation. As we age, our glutathione levels drop. And so what they found is, in the age, as we get older, there is an associated impairment of our white blood cells, the T cells, ability to respond to certain molecules. If they add glutathione to the diets of these older people, they see a reversal of that problem. This is dependent upon glutathione concentrations and cell membrane sulfhydryl integrity. In other words, the cell membrane has SH groups, these thiol groups sticking out. And so mercury can interfere with the thiol groups on the membranes as well as depleting glutathione. Thiol oxidants, anything that reduces glutathione availability or other sulfhydryl reactive molecules, decrease lymphocyte proliferation response to chemicals. Glutathione protects organs from toxicity. We know that research shows that glutathione protects the liver from ethanol-induced oxidative stress, which happens to be mediated by acetaldehyde. We've heard that before, many of us, but it involves the generation of free radicals. Anybody who tied one on last night because you're with friends, that's what happened. We know that glutathione protects kidneys from xenobiotics, including mercury. In fact, I've mentioned that before, that BioProbe has talked about this several times. Glutathione protects other antioxidants in the cytoplasmic or plasma melee, or the environment, the fluid environment surrounding the organized systems of enzymes. So glutathione protects these other antioxidants. And this is a partial list. Depending upon the person you read, I could have had 3 slides up here. And various molecules in living systems have sulfhydryl groups that can be used as an antioxidant if the oxidant status gets to the point that it's necessary. It's not unlike our circulatory system. If we get real cold, it shuts down on the outside and is saving the core temperature. Well, these are all backups, some of them. And many of the other molecules I could have listed up here are backup systems in case these other ones fail. So glutathione protects the superoxide dismutases, ascorbate, vitamin C, glutathione peroxidase, catalase, beta-carotene, cysteine, methionine, albumin, celluloplasmin, bilirubin, uric acid, and hemoglobin. Let's look at one of these. Oops, I hope it's there. There it is. Albumin. Albumin is responsible for the maintenance of plasma osmolarity, or the concentration of proteins within the plasma. It is involved in hormone transport and homeostasis, fatty acid transport and homeostasis, calcium homeostasis, and it binds to trace minerals. What we have with albumin is some type of transport mechanism, homeostatic mechanism, okay? It buffers plasma pH. It's an essential component of copper transport. Now, copper is very important. It's an essential enzyme cofactor in at least 30 enzymes, but it's also extremely toxic. So albumin helps mediate and control copper. Albumin acts as a backup antioxidant. So that is, I'll just leave that on. I thought. I guess I won't. Albumin is one example, and there are many, many more that I could give, of the very critical balances we have to have in our body. In closing, I want to propose very quickly to you, I have about 1 minute left. We've talked about diabetes a couple times. I have an article I'm submitting to the American Diabetic Association. They may spit it back out at me, but that's okay. I'll keep trying. We know that diabetics have an increased rate of decay, so they have more fillings than average. We know they have glutathione depletion. They have lower glutathione levels, and they also have impaired enzymes of glutathione metabolism. Specifically, their glutathione synthetase and glutathione reductase are inhibited. We know they have a lower antioxidant status. They have lower levels of SOD, catalase, vitamin C, vitamin E, and uric acid. We also know that they have increased free radical activity. They have reduced monodeiodinating enzyme activity. They have reduced immune function, impaired lipid metabolism, increased cardiovascular disease, increased polyneuropathies, increased neuropsychological dysfunction, increased reproductive disorders, and increased kidney failure. We know that half the diabetics, they're now diagnosed as diabetics, will have kidney failure within the next 15 years. We're talking possibly 6 to 8 million people with kidney failure in the next 15 years from diabetics alone. Should we be placing amalgams in their mouths? And I say no. Thank you very much.
Well, I'm really glad I got a degree in biochemistry so I can listen to Dr. Strong. I have one announcement, and then I want you to depart this room as quickly as you can and eat, because in 1 hour we will meet back in this room for more exciting information about how good mercury is for the system. And actually, Dr. Yamianis, I believe, leads off in the afternoon. I have one announcement to make regarding the gala dinner arrangements. This is your waning moments to make a reservation for the dinner. Out at front with my front office coordinator, Judy. She's taking the reservations for dinner. And now everybody fold up your books and run like hell, because there's a lot of restaurants next door, and there's also restaurants in this hotel. All of downtown San Diego is going to be out looking for something to eat. Beat them.